In a rugged town where dust clouds swirl in the dry wind, a band of dangerous bikers rolls in with a single goal: to intimidate and dominate the land. They've heard rumors of a rancher living on the outskirts, a silent figure whose reputation is steeped in mystery and fear. Unbeknownst to them, he is not just any rancher. He is the most feared gunslinger in the West, a man whose name has been whispered in terror by criminals far and wide. When the bikers decide to challenge him, they think they have the upper hand. But they quickly learn they've made a deadly mistake. What happens next will unravel their entire criminal empire. This is the story of a man who doesn't speak, but whose actions send ripples of fear through those who cross him. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the small, sun-baked town of Pine Hollow. The streets were empty, save for the occasional stray dog lazily wandering through the dust. The townspeople knew to stay out of sight when the bikers came into town. Big men with big bikes, and an even bigger reputation for destruction. They rolled in like a storm on the horizon, a group of rough men with leather jackets adorned with symbols of power and domination. The leader of the pack, a man named Razor, led the charge. He was tall, muscular, with a scruffy beard that made him look like he belonged to some wild clan of outlaws. His dark sunglasses concealed his eyes, but the rest of his demeanor was a clear signal of aggression. Razor's gang wasn't known for being subtle. They got their name by cutting down anyone who got in their way. "Word is there's a rancher out here," Razor muttered to his crew as they passed the saloon. His voice was low but held an edge of disdain. A silent one. No one's seen him talk in years. Just keeps to his land. The bikers had heard of this rancher. They knew he was reclusive, kept to himself, and owned a large stretch of prime land on the outskirts of town. Rumor had it that he'd once been a gunslinger, though no one knew the details of his past. But in a town like Pine Hollow, that kind of mystery usually meant trouble. "Sounds like an easy target," one of Razor's men chuckled from behind. "You think we can get him to sell out? Maybe take his land?" Razor grinned under his sunglasses, a cruel smirk forming at the corners of his mouth. "We're not here to negotiate," he said. "We're here to take what's ours." The gang revved their engines, sending a roar of sound through the otherwise quiet town. The townsfolk peered through windows, holding their breath. Everyone knew that trouble was about to unfold. They arrived at the ranch just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The ranch itself looked peaceful at first glance, quiet, even serene. A small farmhouse stood at the edge of a vast expanse of land, stretching as far as the eye could see. Fencing ran along the property line, and there were cattle grazing peacefully in the fields. The kind of land that every man in this world would envy. Razor, however, saw only one thing: a challenge. He dismounted from his bike with a growl, his boots thudding against the dry earth as he approached the front door. His men gathered around him, each of them looking eager for a confrontation. A creak of wood echoed through the air as the door of the farmhouse slowly opened. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, wiry, with graying hair and a weathered face. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they locked onto Razor with a piercing gaze. He said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence commanding the attention of the bikers. The air around him seemed to hold its breath. Razor sneered, stepping forward with a cocky confidence. "You the rancher? Thought you'd be a little more talkative." The rancher didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. His hands rested casually at his sides, but Razor noticed something. Beneath the old coat the man wore, there was the distinct shape of a holster, the unmistakable outline of a gun. A strange unease gripped Razor's chest, but he quickly shook it off. "You know, I don't like people who don't talk," Razor growled. "Maybe I'll change that for you." The rancher didn't move. His eyes remained steady, unwavering, like the calm before a storm. Razor motioned to his gang. "Let's show this silent cowboy what happens when you cross the wrong men." Before Razor could finish his sentence, the first of his bikers lunged forward, cracking a whip that hung from his belt. The rancher remained motionless, his gaze never leaving Razor's face. But there was something else in the air now, a sense of anticipation, as if the very land around them knew what was about to unfold. The silence that followed Razor's order hung heavy in the air. The gang members moved in, all eager to assert their dominance, to make the rancher feel their weight. They were used to fear, used to bending people to their will with brute force. But there was something about this rancher that made the air crackle with tension, a stillness that made the bikers second-guess their every move. Razor, trying to shake off the unease crawling up his spine, nodded at his men to close in. The first biker, a hulking man named Crank, swung his whip toward the rancher, its cracks slicing through the air like a thunderclap. But the rancher's reaction was swift. His hand moved, faster than the eye could follow, and in a blink, the gun was in his grip. A flash of steel and the sharp sound of a bullet slicing through the air rang out. Crank's whip was suddenly cut in two, the leather falling to the ground in two separate pieces. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Crank stood there, wide-eyed, staring at the empty space where his weapon had just been. The sound of the gunshot echoed in their ears, but the rancher didn't flinch. His hand remained steady, the gun pointed not at Crank, but at the ground. A warning. Razor's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the rancher's silence press down on him like a physical force. "You made a mistake," Razor said, his voice less sure now. "You could have walked away, but you didn't." The rancher didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lowered the gun, his eyes never leaving Razor's. For a moment, Razor's men hesitated, unsure. But then, the challenge was too great to ignore. The bikers surged forward as one, all thinking the same thing. Overpower him, take control. But they underestimated the rancher's speed and precision. A second shot rang out. This time, a biker named Jax, the largest of the group, collapsed to the ground, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck. His face twisted in shock as he sank to his knees, the pain of the wound taking him down faster than he could comprehend. "Move, damn it," Razor barked, though his voice was tinged with fear now. The bikers scattered, scrambling to surround the rancher, but it was like trying to corner a ghost. Every time they thought they had him, his gun flashed, and another man fell to the dirt. The rancher wasn't fast. He was precise. He was methodical. Every bullet he fired hit its target with deadly accuracy, never wasting a shot. He didn't flinch, didn't even seem to care. It was as if he had done this 1,000 times before, and Razor realized, with an icy jolt, that he likely had. The gang's bravado quickly turned to panic. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. Razor, his bravado now a mere memory, raised his hands, signaling for his men to back off. But it was too late. The rancher's reputation as a silent figure was shattered with every bullet that found its mark. The bikers were scrambling now, retreating in disarray, trying to regroup. But the rancher didn't give them the chance. He stepped forward, his boots crunching the dry earth beneath him, each movement calm, deliberate. His eyes were locked onto Razor's now, and Razor felt a cold sweat running down the back of his neck. "Do you know who I am?" Razor spat, though the words lacked the venom they once had. His voice trembled ever so slightly, his confidence slipping. The rancher's lips twitched, just the faintest flicker of a smile. But it was enough. Enough to confirm Razor's worst fear. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Razor continued, his voice rising, trying to steady himself. "You know what happens when you mess with us?" The rancher's eyes never wavered. He didn't answer with words, but his gaze was enough to silence Razor. Razor swallowed hard, feeling a sense of dread crawl through his gut. He didn't know who this man was, but he could feel it now. He was not just some quiet rancher. This man was a force, a storm waiting to unleash. Suddenly, the rancher spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of stones grinding against one another. "You've made your last mistake." The words hit Razor like a punch to the chest, and for the first time in a long time he didn't know what to do. His instincts, usually sharp and quick, were dulled by a fear he hadn't felt in years. The rancher's presence was suffocating, overpowering. Razor could almost hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the back of his mind. Steps that didn't belong to him, but to something much darker. The bikers, now scattered and panicked, looked to Razor for direction, but there was nothing left in their leader. His confidence had evaporated, and in its place was a cold, hard reality. The rancher had not just outgunned them, he had outclassed them in every way. The gang's empire, built on fear and violence, had just encountered the one thing it couldn't defeat: the true meaning of power. The silence that followed felt like a thunderclap in the air, the tension thick enough to cut through. Razor stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what had just happened. His men were disoriented, some of them nursing wounds, others too frightened to even move. The rancher hadn't just disarmed them, he had dismantled their entire sense of control, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Razor's hand clenched into a fist, his pulse pounding in his ears. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in charge. The rancher had taken that from him, and it burned in a way that was more humiliating than anything Razor had ever experienced. "You know, I don't take kindly to being challenged," the rancher said, his voice low but steady. He was still calm, too calm. It was almost unnatural. Razor's jaw tightened. "You're just one man. You can't take us all down." The rancher gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I don't need to." With those words, he turned his back on Razor and his gang, walking slowly toward the barn. His boots thudded against the dirt, and every step seemed to send a shockwave through the bikers, whose fear grew with each passing moment. Razor's mind raced. What was the rancher trying to do? Was he trying to intimidate them further? Was he planning something? The mystery of the man began to gnaw at him. He wasn't just any rancher, and this wasn't just about a turf war anymore. It was something deeper. Razor took a shaky step forward, his voice low but edged with fury. "You think you can get away with this? We'll burn this place to the ground, you hear me? This town belongs to us." The rancher didn't stop. He reached the barn door and paused, his back still to the gang. "No, Razor. It doesn't." There was a chilling finality to those words. Razor's eyes darted to his men, but they looked just as lost as he felt. Their once unshakable confidence had been shattered. He tried to maintain some semblance of authority, his voice rising in an attempt to rally his crew. "Get up. Get your guns. We're not letting this guy." But as his words echoed through the air, something strange happened. The rancher stepped into the barn, and Razor noticed the faintest glimmer of movement behind the barn door. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to catch his attention. Something inside Razor clicked. The rancher wasn't just prepared for a fight, he was expecting it. The air around them felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Before Razor could take another step, a sound echoed from inside the barn. It was faint at first, just a subtle rattle. But then it became louder, sharper. A series of metallic clangs followed by the unmistakable sound of a weapon being drawn. The rancher's head turned slightly, just enough for Razor to see the flash of something cold and metallic in his hand. It wasn't a regular gun. This was something different. Razor's gut churned. The rancher wasn't just a gunslinger. He was something far more dangerous. From within the barn came the unmistakable sound of old leather creaking and the faint rattle of chains. It was like something from the depths of hell was stirring. Razor's heart began to race. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but his pride held him in place. He wouldn't let this man, this silent figure, break him. He wouldn't let anyone make him feel like less. "Get in there!" Razor barked at his men, his voice cracked with desperation. But none of the bikers moved. They stood frozen, staring at the barn, as if waiting for some kind of signal. The dread in the air was suffocating. Razor turned to face them, fury boiling in his chest. "You all better wake up. Do you want to live? Or do you want to die here?" His voice cut through the silence, but there was no fire behind it, only fear. The rancher, still standing inside the barn, didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than words ever could. Razor's men exchanged looks, but none of them dared to make a move. And then, without warning, the barn door swung open wide. For a brief moment, Razor couldn't believe what he was seeing. Behind the rancher stood something massive, something that belonged in the darkest corners of nightmares. It wasn't just a man anymore. It was a presence, a force. A gleaming black stallion stood beside the rancher, its eyes as dark and empty as the night sky. The horse was enormous, built like a warhorse, its body rippling with power. But it wasn't just the size of the animal that caught Razor's attention. It was the way the rancher moved with it, as if they were one. Razor's breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't just a rancher. This was something far older, something far more dangerous than any criminal Razor had ever crossed paths with. "Where did you get that?" one of Razor's men whispered in awe. The rancher didn't answer. He just stepped forward, the horse following him as if it were an extension of his own body. Razor felt a chill run down his spine. "What the hell is this?" he whispered under his breath. And then, the rancher spoke again, his voice carrying like thunder through the air. "I told you, Razor, you've made your last mistake." The words hung heavy in the air, but this time, Razor wasn't sure if it was the man or the horse that had sealed their fate. Razor's heart hammered in his chest, the sound like a drum in his ears. The rancher and the massive black stallion stood before him, their presence commanding the land itself. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the earth itself had come alive in response to the rancher's silent power. The bikers were paralyzed, their eyes wide with fear, none of them daring to move or speak. The silence that followed felt more suffocating than the windless heat of the midday desert. Razor's mouth went dry. He had encountered all manner of people in his life, but this was something else entirely. The rancher was no mere man. Razor had known that the moment the first shot rang out, but now, standing in front of this silent figure and the beast beside him, he understood the full weight of the danger. This wasn't just a gunslinger. This was a man whose very existence seemed to bend reality itself. The rancher's hand slowly slid into the saddlebag of the horse, his movements slow and deliberate. The horse stood still, as if it were waiting, as if it too understood the significance of the moment. Razor felt his breath catch in his throat, his hands trembling slightly as the rancher's eyes shifted toward him again, dark and unblinking. "You don't belong here," the rancher said, his voice as soft and deadly as the wind that whispered through the barren land. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. The rancher didn't need to elaborate. Razor could feel it deep in his gut. He wasn't just a visitor in this world. He was an intruder. But Razor was Razor. He wasn't about to go out like this. His pride burned in his chest, and it fueled his next words, though they came out much shakier than he'd intended. "We own this land. All of it. This is our town. You're nothing but an old man with a dead horse." The rancher didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. Instead, he reached into the saddlebag and pulled something out. Razor couldn't see what it was at first, but the glint of metal caught the fading light of the day. A sword. A long, gleaming blade, shining with a coldness that seemed to reflect every failure, every wrong Razor had ever committed. The rancher's fingers curled around it as though it were an extension of his own arm. He didn't pull it free with force. It simply emerged from its sheath with a practiced ease that sent a shiver down Razor's spine. For a moment, Razor didn't know what to do. He had expected a gunfight. He had prepared himself for violence, but not this. The sword was an ancient weapon, one that told a story all on its own. This wasn't just a man with a gun or a rancher protecting his land. This was something deeper, something with a history that stretched back far beyond the life Razor had known. The rancher looked at Razor, his eyes dark and fathomless. "This land is mine, Razor. It always has been." The words struck Razor like a bolt of lightning, and for the first time, he felt fear creep up his spine, deep and unrelenting. This was no simple rancher. This was a man of legend, someone whose name had faded from the tongues of men but whose power still lived, etched into the bones of the earth. The gang was frozen in place, too stunned to move, too terrified to act. The rancher stepped forward, the horse moving in tandem with him, a perfect symphony of control and grace. The blade in his hand shimmered in the fading sunlight, each movement precise and deliberate. Razor swallowed hard, trying to shake off the fear that had taken root in his chest. He wasn't going to back down. Not here. Not now. Enough of this, Razor growled, trying to force his voice to sound strong, to force his hands to stop trembling. You think you can scare us off with your old tricks? You think you can make us leave? But the rancher's gaze was unwavering. The man didn't speak again. Instead, he turned his back, leading the horse away from the group of bikers, his movements slow but deliberate. Razor's chest tightened with anger, but he was also deeply unsettled. Something about the rancher's calm dismissal. It felt like the calm before a storm. Razor's men stood still too scared to make a move, but Razor's pride surged again, this time stronger than the fear that gripped him. He couldn't let this man get away with it. He couldn't let this silent figure make them feel small. Get on your bikes. We're going after him, Razor barked, his voice desperate, trying to regain some semblance of control. He looked to his men, but even as he said the words, he saw doubt in their eyes. They weren't sure anymore. They weren't sure they wanted to follow him into this fight. The rancher had shattered their belief that they could control anything. But Razor wasn't about to admit defeat. He couldn't. I'll deal with him myself, he said, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, his boots crunching the dry earth beneath him. His hand instinctively reached for his gun. But as he did, something changed. The air shifted. A low, rumbling sound began to fill the air, distant at first, but growing louder, growing stronger. It was the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, of something coming toward them with incredible speed. Razor turned, his heart skipping a beat as he saw a shadow moving fast through the dust. His eyes widened as the figure of the rancher came charging toward him on the black stallion. The horse's hooves struck the ground like thunder, the sound reverberating through Razor's chest, making his heart race in panic. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was an inevitability. The rancher's eyes locked with Razor's one last time, and in that moment, Razor understood the truth. This man, this figure who had walked the earth in silence, had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for the moment when his enemies would finally come to him, and when the time came, he would show them what real power looked like. The rancher's blade gleamed as he raised it, and Razor knew that no matter how many men he had, no matter how many bikes they rode, none of it mattered. This was a reckoning, and Razor had crossed the line. The earth trembled beneath Razor's feet as the rancher and his stallion barreled toward him with a speed that was almost supernatural. The dust kicked up in clouds behind the massive animal, and the sound of hooves thundering against the dry earth sent a cold shiver down Razor's spine. Every instinct in him screamed to move, to get out of the way, but something in the rancher's gaze held him in place. The silence between them spoke volumes more than any words could. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The ground under Razor's boots felt unsteady. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the rancher's unwavering eyes bore down on him like an immovable force of nature. The rancher didn't speak, not a single word, but there was something in the way he held the blade firm, controlled, waiting, that made Razor's blood run cold. Razor's hand instinctively moved to his gun, but he could feel the weight of that decision bearing down on him. He knew this wouldn't be a typical shootout, and every fiber of his being screamed that he wasn't prepared for this fight. The black stallion was almost upon him now, its powerful muscles propelling it with terrifying grace, the man atop it moving with a fluidity that seemed to transcend the human. Razor's heart skipped as the rancher leaned low in the saddle, the blade glinting in the dying light of the day. "Get out of the way!" Razor yelled, his voice more desperate now. He raised his own weapon, trembling fingers clutching the handle of his revolver. His men stood still, too frightened to act, their eyes wide with fear as they looked from Razor to the silent man who now towered over them on horseback. The rancher's cold gaze never left Razor, as though the fate of this entire encounter was already sealed, already written in the air between them. And then the rancher moved. The stallion surged forward with a primal roar, its hooves striking the earth like thunder as it closed the distance between them in an instant. Razor had only a fraction of a second to react, but his fear paralyzed him. He fired a desperate shot that cut through the air, but the rancher was faster. His blade flashed in the dimming light, moving in an arc so clean, so precise, that it felt as if the air itself had bent to its will. The sound of metal cutting through the air was followed by the sickening thud of Razor's gun falling from his hand. The bullet he had fired soared harmlessly into the sky, missing its mark completely. Razor's eyes widened as he looked down at his hand. His gun was gone, severed in the blink of an eye, the barrel neatly sliced in two. But it didn't stop there. The rancher didn't stop, didn't break his stride. With terrifying efficiency, he swung the blade again, and this time, Razor felt the sting of the edge on his shoulder. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to send a bolt of pain through his body, enough to make him stagger backward, eyes wide in shock. Razor had underestimated him. He had underestimated the sheer skill and power of the man standing before him. The rancher's eyes never wavered. His gaze remained steady, unblinking, as he adjusted his position in the saddle and guided the stallion around Razor. Not a word exchanged, not a sound made. Razor stood there, frozen in fear and disbelief, watching as the rancher circled him. "Get him!" Razor shouted to his men, his voice shaky now, the anger in his tone a feeble mask over the panic that clawed at him. "He's just one man. Get him!" But none of them moved. They were too scared, too paralyzed by the suddenness of the rancher's attack. They had never seen anything like this before. This wasn't a typical fight. It wasn't even a fight at all. It was a slaughter, a brutal reminder of how fragile their empire truly was. The rancher continued to circle them, his movements graceful, fluid, like a predator toying with its prey. Razor's breathing became erratic as the rancher rode past him again, coming to a stop in front of him. The rancher looked down at him, his face expressionless, the weight of his silence pressing down like a physical force. Razor's hands shook as he reached for his gun again, but he couldn't bring himself to draw it. He knew it was pointless. He could feel it now. There was no fighting this man, not with brute force, not with anything they had. And then, something changed. The rancher finally spoke. "Your empire is crumbling," he said, his voice low, yet carrying with the weight of finality. "It's already fallen." Razor's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. The truth of the words hung in the air, a bitter reality that none of them had seen coming. The empire they had built through fear, violence, and corruption was nothing in the face of this man's quiet strength. "You've lived by terror, but terror doesn't last," the rancher continued, his eyes never leaving Razor's. "And now, your empire is a dying breath in the wind." The bikers were standing still now, paralyzed, staring at their leader, waiting for him to act. But there was nothing left for Razor to do. He could feel the weight of the rancher's words, and with it, he felt the collapse of everything he had built. This wasn't just about land. It was about survival. It was about power, and the rancher held it now. Razor opened his mouth to speak, to deny the truth, but his words died in his throat. He felt something inside him crack, the realization that there was no escape, no way out. The rancher wasn't just taking control of this land. He was tearing apart everything Razor had ever stood for. Without another word, the rancher turned, his horse's hooves striking the ground as he moved toward the barn again, the metallic gleam of his blade still catching the last rays of sunlight. Razor stood motionless, unable to speak, unable to move. The bikers began to murmur amongst themselves, fear and doubt creeping into their hearts. One by one, they realized what had just happened. They had been defeated not by force, but by the sheer, unyielding presence of a man who was no longer part of their world. The rancher had shattered their empire, and what was left in its wake would be a broken, helpless gang, lost in the dust. The rancher's movements were deliberate, unhurried as he dismounted from his stallion and entered the barn. The sound of his boots on the dry earth was the only noise in the aftermath of the chaos. Razor stood frozen, his hands still shaking, his mind racing to make sense of what had just transpired. His men remained motionless, still processing the overwhelming defeat. A sense of finality hung in the air, like a storm that had already passed, leaving nothing but desolation in its wake. The bikers, once so confident and unruly, now stood in stunned silence. Razor could hear the faint murmurs of his men, whispers that carried the realization of their defeat. They had tried to dominate, to rule with fear, and in an instant, it had all been shattered by one man. The rancher hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a grand gesture. He had simply been who he was, and in doing so, he had destroyed everything Razor and his gang stood for. Razor's chest tightened as he fought to regain control. His eyes flickered toward his men, who now seemed more like ghosts than the hardened outlaws they had once been. Fear had drained them of their bravado, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke them. "This isn't over," Razor muttered through gritted teeth, his voice raw. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that they could rise again, that they could fight back. But deep down, he knew the truth. The rancher had taken everything from them. His gun, his power, his men's loyalty. And now, there was nothing left but the crushing weight of defeat. The rancher reappeared from the barn, holding a saddlebag in his hands. His gaze remained focused on Razor, his face impassive, as if he were looking through him rather than at him. "I gave you a choice," the rancher said, his voice low, but it carried a power that seemed to vibrate through Razor's bones. "You could have walked away, but you chose this." Razor's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" His words were desperate, but he couldn't stop them. His pride had been shattered, his empire crumbled. All he had left was anger. The rancher's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, Razor felt a flicker of something ancient and terrifying. The rancher wasn't just a man. He wasn't just a rancher. He was something else, something that had outlived the world Razor knew. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, an unspoken promise of power that Razor could never hope to understand. "You're wrong," the rancher replied, his voice still calm. "This is just the beginning." Razor's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to take his men and disappear before the rancher could make good on whatever threat was lurking in those quiet words. But as Razor glanced over at his men, he saw something that made his blood run cold. They weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes had turned toward the rancher. Their allegiance had already shifted, without a word being spoken. They were lost, drawn to the power that the rancher radiated, and it was as if they knew their time with Razor had ended. "Get on your bikes," Razor commanded, his voice hoarse. His words felt empty now. "We're leaving," but it was too late. One by one, his men began to move toward the rancher, as though they were no longer afraid of him, no longer bound by the loyalty they had once had for Razor. One by one, they dismounted from their bikes and stepped forward, drawn toward the man who had brought them to their knees. Razor's mind raced as he looked around at the crumbling remnants of his empire. The rancher had taken everything, not just their land, not just their power, but their very sense of identity. They had been nothing without fear, nothing without control. And now they had nothing at all. As his men gathered around the rancher, Razor felt a sharp pain in his chest. The anger that had driven him for so long dissolved into something darker, something deeper. It was the realization that he had failed, not just to conquer the rancher, but to understand the true nature of power. The rancher's gaze shifted from Razor to the men who had once followed him. "You're free," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "The empire you built was built on lies, on fear. You don't need that anymore." The words echoed in Razor's ears, and for the first time, he understood the rancher's power. It wasn't in his gun. It wasn't in his sword. It wasn't even in his presence. It was in the way he spoke the truth, quietly, calmly, but with such certainty that it shattered everything in its path. And just like that, Razor's men made their choice. They turned away from him, from the life they had known, and followed the rancher into the unknown. Razor stood alone, surrounded by the remnants of his gang. the sound of their departure ringing in his ears like a funeral bell. His empire was gone, lost to the wind. The rancher had broken them, not with force, but with something far more devastating: the truth. Razor's fists clenched as he watched the last of his men disappear into the barn, led by the rancher. His heart burned with rage, but even that was beginning to feel hollow. He had no allies now, no strength left, just a deep, gnawing emptiness. The rancher stopped at the door of the barn, turning one last time to look at Razor. The rancher's eyes held no pity, no judgment, just a cold, indifferent finality. "Leave now," the rancher said, "before it's too late." Razor stood motionless, his chest heaving, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. There was nothing left. The rancher had won. And as Razor turned and walked toward his bike, he realized that the empire he had spent years building was nothing more than a house of cards, toppled by a man who didn't need to say a word to bring it all down. Razor's boots thudded heavily against the earth as he made his way toward his bike, every step feeling like a weight being dragged across the ground. The rancher's words still echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something that transcended anything he had ever known. He didn't even look back. His heart pounded, his breath coming in short gasps. As he mounted his bike and started the engine, the roar of the machine seemed hollow, like a mockery of the power it once represented. He had spent years building his empire, creating fear and violence, dominating the land and the people in it. And now, here he was, beaten by a man who didn't need to raise his voice, let alone a weapon. Razor's hand gripped the handlebars tighter, his knuckles white. His mind raced with thoughts of vengeance, of how he would make the rancher pay for this humiliation. But deep down, he knew there was nothing left to fight for. He had been defeated, and it wasn't just by the rancher. It was by the very truth that the man had spoken. Razor's empire, built on lies and violence, had been nothing more than a brittle foundation, ready to crumble the moment it was truly tested. The sun was nearly gone now, the last traces of daylight slipping away into the horizon. As Razor sped through the town, the silence that had descended upon it was deafening. No one dared to move, no one dared to look up. The streets, once filled with the rumble of bikes and the clatter of barroom brawls, were now ghostly empty. Razor's thoughts drifted to his men, the ones who had followed him for so long. His mind flickered to their faces, their fear, their hesitation, and then the look in their eyes as they turned toward the rancher. It had been as if they had awakened from a nightmare, as if they had seen the truth for the first time. They were no longer the same men who had joined him in this venture. They had found something else in the rancher, something stronger, something that Razor couldn't even begin to understand. But that didn't stop him from feeling the gnawing need for revenge. He sped out of town, heading for the hills beyond, where the remnants of his once great empire lay scattered across the land. As he drove, the wind lashed against his face, and the sting of it felt like a slap, sharp, biting, reminding him of his failure. He needed time to think, to regroup, to figure out how he could fight back. As he crested a ridge, Razor slowed, the view of the town stretching out before him. The ranch, far in the distance, stood like a silent sentinel, the barn where his men had gone to follow the rancher now a distant, shadowed silhouette. It felt as if that barn had become the heart of something dark, something powerful that Razor couldn't even begin to comprehend. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant rumble, low, but growing louder, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Razor turned his head sharply, his instincts telling him something was coming. He couldn't see anything at first, but the rumble grew, and then, like a wave crashing in the distance, a cloud of dust began to rise on the horizon. At first, Razor thought it was the wind, or perhaps his imagination. But then, as the dust began to swirl, he realized it was something else entirely. It was a herd, no, not just any herd. It was a force moving toward him, toward the town. The ground seemed to shake with the rhythm of it. The herd drew closer, and Razor's eyes widened as he realized what it was. Riders. A group of them, riding fast, riding hard. They were coming from the rancher's direction, and there were more of them than Razor had ever seen in one place before. Each rider was clad in black, their faces obscured by scarves or helmets, their eyes cold and focused as they moved with precision, like a unit. Razor's heart began to pound as they drew closer. This was no ordinary group of men. This wasn't a gang or a collection of stragglers. These were soldiers, or something far worse. He watched in awe, a mixture of fear and curiosity eating at him. The riders didn't seem to notice him. They were headed for the town, riding in perfect formation, their pace unrelenting, their goal clear. Razor's fingers twitched around the throttle of his bike, but for the first time, fear overtook him. He knew deep down that these riders weren't here by chance. They were here because of the rancher, and as they approached the town, Razor realized the full scope of the rancher's reach. He wasn't just a man. He was the center of something larger, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of this small town. Razor's mind raced with questions. Who were these riders? What did they want? And why had the rancher called them here? The riders pulled into the town without hesitation, their horses moving in a synchronized dance, their eyes scanning the streets as they prepared for something. Razor didn't know what to do. He had been the one who controlled this town, the one who had terrified its people. And now, in a matter of days, it felt as if he had lost everything. The town wasn't his anymore. Nothing was. He watched in silence as the riders dismounted with eerie precision, their movements sharp, calculated. They lined up in front of the saloon, their faces hidden in the shadows of their helmets, but their presence was undeniable. The air around them seemed to crackle with intensity, as if they carried with them the weight of a storm about to break. Razor's hands were clammy as he clutched the handlebars of his bike. He had to make a decision, he had to act. But what could he do? His empire had already crumbled. His men had abandoned him, and now these riders were here. For what? And then, as if answering his unspoken question, one of the riders approached the saloon door, his boots clicking on the wooden floor with deliberate steps. The door creaked open, and Razor could see him slip inside. A chill ran down his spine. The rancher had sent them. Razor didn't know how much longer he could stand it. The darkness was closing in, and all he could do was watch as the life he had known began to unravel, piece by piece, until all that remained was the eerie quiet of a town that had already given itself over to something far greater than fear, greater than power. It was something else entirely. Razor's mind raced, his fingers twitching with the desperate urge to act, to do something. But the air around him was too thick with tension. As he watched the riders dismount one by one, it became clear that this wasn't just some typical gang showing up. It was an army. Their movements were too synchronized, too precise. Razor had always been a man of action, quick on his feet, always calculating the next move. But now, he felt paralyzed, as if the world had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him with nothing but a gnawing sense of helplessness. He turned his bike off and slid it into the shadows, trying to remain unseen. The riders didn't notice him. Their focus was entirely on the ranch, on the man who had taken everything from him. Razor's chest tightened as he slowly made his way toward the edge of town, keeping himself concealed behind the nearby buildings. His heart pounded in his ears, his breath shallow as he watched the riders gather at the saloon. They weren't here to intimidate. They weren't here to cause chaos. No, they were here for something much more dangerous. They were here to take control. As Razor watched from his hiding spot, he could see the leader of the riders, a man who stood taller than the rest, his black helmet reflecting the dim light of the street lamps, approach the saloon door. He reached up, pulling off the helmet with deliberate slowness, and Razor caught a glimpse of his face. The man's eyes were cold, sharp, unfeeling. He was a soldier, trained, disciplined, and utterly focused on his mission. Razor's pulse quickened. He had thought he had seen everything, but this was something else entirely. The gang, the bikers who had once ruled this town, had been nothing more than a small-time operation in comparison. These riders weren't just looking to conquer. They were here to dismantle everything. Inside the saloon, the silence was deafening. Razor could see the darkened shapes of the riders as they entered, their movements swift and purposeful. The doors swung shut behind them, and a tense stillness settled over the street. Razor's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had always been the one who struck first, the one who planned and dominated. But now, standing in the shadows, he felt as if he were at the mercy of forces he couldn't control. A part of him wanted to turn back. He wanted to flee, to abandon the fight altogether, but another part, the part that had survived all these years, whispered that there was still a chance to regain control. He had to know what the rancher was doing. He had to understand why this was happening. Razor crept forward, making his way toward the saloon. He moved like a shadow, blending with the night, his heart hammering with anticipation and fear. He couldn't let them take everything without knowing why, without knowing what came next. He reached the saloon's back door, just as it creaked open slightly, the shadows of the riders flickering through the crack. Razor held his breath, listening intently. The low murmur of voices drifted from inside. "You know what to do," a cold voice said, unmistakably the leader of the riders. Razor strained to hear the words, trying to make sense of what was going on. Another rider's voice responded, sharp and clipped. "The rancher's orders are clear. We take control of the town and then we move to the next one. The empire is crumbling, but we can rebuild. This is just the beginning." Razor's blood ran cold. The rancher's orders? The rancher wasn't just a lone figure. He wasn't just some man protecting his land. He was a leader, commanding an army, a force that stretched far beyond what Razor had ever imagined. The riders weren't here to loot. They weren't here for petty vengeance. They were here to reshape the very foundation of the world Razor had built, and the rancher was at the center of it. The words echoed in Razor's ears as he stepped back, his mind reeling. His empire had never been about wealth or land, it had always been about power. And now, with the arrival of these riders, it was clear that power was slipping through his fingers. He turned and sprinted away from the saloon, not looking back. His breath came fast as he made his way toward the edge of town, toward the hills that overlooked the valley below. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its cold light over the landscape, as if mocking him. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The rancher wasn't just the most feared gunslinger. He was the head of a revolution, a movement that was going to crush everything in its path. Razor wasn't just dealing with one man now. He was up against something far more dangerous, a force of nature. And Razor knew with sickening certainty that there was no going back. Razor's boots kicked up dust as he made his way through the barren hills, his mind racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The cold night air bit at his skin, but it was the storm brewing in his chest that hurt the most. The words of the riders, the coldness in their voices, echoed in his mind. The rancher's orders are clear. We take control of the town, and then we move to the next one. The empire he had built, the empire that had once been a force to be reckoned with, was crumbling. And in its place, something else was rising. Razor had been so sure of himself for so long. He had believed that power was something you could seize, something you could control with fear and violence. But now, standing on the edge of everything he had once believed in, he saw the truth. Power wasn't something you could hold onto through brute force. It wasn't something you could force out of others. It was something deeper, something that came from silence, from control, from the quiet strength of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. And the rancher knew that strength. Razor's failure wasn't just in his defeat. It was in his failure to understand the rancher's true power. His mind raced as he reached the edge of the hills, looking down at the town below. The riders had already begun to move through the streets. Their presence, like an ominous shadow, hung over the town. Razor could feel it in his bones. The rancher was turning this place into something else, something that no longer had a place for him. He had to do something. The urge for revenge still burned within him, but now it was mingled with a sense of desperation. What had started as a desire to conquer had become something else entirely. It was survival. It was the primal need to hold on to something, anything, that could give him a semblance of control over the chaos that had overtaken his life. Razor didn't know what he was looking for, but he had to find it. He had to find a way to turn the tide back in his favor, to regain even a fraction of the power he had lost. As he stood there, staring down at the town, a movement caught his eye. One of the riders, a lone figure, was walking away from the group, heading toward the outskirts of town. Razor narrowed his eyes. The rider wasn't like the others. His posture was relaxed, confident, almost too relaxed. Razor could feel the tension in the air shift, a subtle shift that told him this was no ordinary rider. The rider stopped at the edge of the town and turned, his eyes scanning the landscape. Razor's breath caught in his throat as he saw the rider pull something from beneath his cloak. A long, slender piece of metal. It was a sword. The rider unsheathed the blade, its dark metal gleaming in the moonlight, and Razor could see the faintest flicker of movement in the distance. The rancher's men, the riders, were positioning themselves, moving with quiet precision, ready to carry out whatever plan the rancher had set in motion. Razor's mind raced. He had to get closer. He had to find out what was happening, what the rancher's plan truly was. But more than that, he had to find a way to stop it. With that thought burning in his chest, Razor began to make his way toward the town, keeping to the shadows. The cool night air bit at his skin as he moved quickly, his mind whirling with possibilities. The riders, the rancher, the growing sense of dread that had settled over the town. He had to get to the center of it all. He had to face the rancher again, and this time he would not be caught off guard. As he neared the town, Razor saw the figures of the riders standing watch at various points along the street. They were guarding something, waiting for something. Razor's pulse quickened as he realized that they were not just waiting for orders. They were waiting for the signal. The town had already fallen under the rancher's control, and Razor knew it wouldn't be long before the riders turned their sights elsewhere. Perhaps even beyond the town, to other territories that the gang had once ruled. Razor wasn't just fighting for control anymore. He was fighting for survival, fighting to keep what little power he had left. He crept closer, his breath shallow, until he found a narrow alleyway that led toward the heart of the town. The sound of the riders' boots against the cobblestones echoed in the distance, but Razor pressed on. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the impending storm, as if the world itself were holding its breath. As he rounded the corner, he saw the saloon ahead. The doors were shut, but the faint flicker of light from inside cast long shadows across the street. The riders were moving in and out, their faces masked by shadows, their expressions unreadable. Razor hesitated, feeling the overwhelming weight of the situation. The rancher was inside. The rancher had already won. But Razor wasn't ready to accept that. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and made his way toward the saloon. The moment had come. The rancher would face him once more. And this time, Razor knew it wouldn't be a quick fight. It wouldn't be about power or control, it would be about survival. Razor had made his choice, and whatever came next, he would face it with everything he had left. The saloon loomed ahead, its heavy wooden door casting a long shadow in the dim light of the street. Razor's pulse hammered in his ears as he approached, each step measured, each breath steady but shallow. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the knowledge that he was no longer the man in control, no longer the one who could dictate the future. His world, once so carefully constructed, had already begun to unravel. The rancher, with his quiet strength and unyielding will, had shattered everything Razor had built. Now, Razor was left with only one option: to face him once again. He reached the saloon doors, pausing for just a moment to gather himself. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges loud in the otherwise silent street. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The riders had gathered around the bar, their eyes shifting between the door and the shadows, watching for any movement. The room fell silent as Razor stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, the weight of their gaze like a physical force. But Razor didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He had to stand his ground. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the rancher. And then he saw him. The rancher sat at the far end of the bar, his back straight, his presence commanding the space around him. The same black stallion that had been his companion earlier stood quietly by the window, its dark eyes flickering toward Razor as if it too were waiting for the inevitable. Razor's breath caught in his throat. There was no more bravado left in him now, no more defiance. The rancher wasn't just a man. He was something far beyond that. A force of nature, an embodiment of the world Razor had failed to understand. And now, as Razor stood facing him, he knew there was no turning back. The rancher didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His silence was as potent as any weapon, his presence enough to hold Razor in place. The room felt cold, almost as if the air itself was heavy with the unspoken history between them. Razor opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say anymore. His anger, his thirst for revenge, those things seemed so hollow now. There was no power in them, no purpose. The rancher turned his gaze toward him, his eyes dark, unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. But then the rancher spoke, his voice low, almost gentle. Yet it carried a weight that made Razor's heart race. "You shouldn't have come here," the rancher said, his words calm, measured. Razor's jaw clenched, the weight of the rancher's words sinking into him like a stone dropped in water. He had come here for answers, for a reason to keep fighting, but the rancher's voice, his presence, seemed to strip away everything Razor had clung to. The world he had known, the empire he had built on fear and violence, was no more. "I had to," Razor said, his voice hoarse, betraying the turmoil inside him. "I can't let you do this. You can't take everything from me." The rancher's eyes softened slightly, but there was no pity in them, no sympathy. "You've already lost everything, Razor," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The land, the people, the power, it's all crumbling. You can't fight what's already gone." Razor's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms as the words stung. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just take it all? What makes you so different?" For the briefest moment, the rancher's gaze flickered to the sword at his side. The weapon was a symbol, a quiet testament to the rancher's past. A past that Razor could never fully understand. The rancher's eyes returned to him, and the silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. "I'm not better than you," the rancher said softly. "I'm just not willing to live in the lies you built. You built your empire on fear, on forcing people to bend to your will. But fear doesn't last. It never does." Razor's chest tightened. The rancher's words cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He had been the one who controlled this town, this world, with his violence. And now, the rancher had come and torn it all apart with nothing more than his presence. His quiet conviction. "I didn't have a choice," Razor spat, his anger flaring once again. "You think I wanted to do all of this? You think I wanted to hurt people? But that's the world we live in. That's how you survive." The rancher's expression didn't change, but there was something in the way he stood that made Razor feel small. He wasn't just a man who fought to survive. He was a man who had already won without lifting a finger. "You were never fighting to survive," the rancher replied. "You were fighting to control, to dominate. And now it's too late." Razor's heart raced, his mind whirling. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face the truth, but the rancher was right. Everything he had built had been a lie, and now it was crumbling piece by piece. "You've already lost, Razor," the rancher continued, his voice still calm, still unwavering. "You can walk away now, and I'll let you go. But if you stay, you'll lose everything. I've already won." Razor's mind screamed for him to fight, to stand up, to prove that he could still control the situation. But his body felt heavy, as if it was being weighed down by the sheer weight of the rancher's words. He had nothing left. No empire, no power, no loyalty from his men. The room was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Razor's breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling, his fists still clenched at his sides. The rancher's presence pressed down on him like a vice, and for the first time in his life, Razor knew what it was like to truly be powerless. Without another word, the rancher stood from his seat, the soft scrape of his boots on the wooden floor echoing in the silence. He moved toward the door, his every step a reminder that the world had changed, that Razor's time had passed. "I gave you a choice," the rancher said quietly, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Now it's too late." Razor stood frozen, his mind still trying to process the truth, still grasping at the remnants of the world he had once known. But as the rancher stepped outside, Razor knew there was no going back. The empire he had built was gone, and no amount of violence or power could bring it back. The silence of the saloon pressed down on him, and in that moment, Razor understood. The storm had already passed, and he had lost. Razor stood alone in the saloon, the silence ringing in his ears like a death knell. The rancher's words still echoed in his mind, each one a heavy blow that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of his existence. "You've already lost," the rancher had said, and Razor knew deep down that those words were more than just a statement. They were a truth he had been avoiding for years. The emptiness in the room pressed in on him, suffocating. The riders had left, their boots echoing as they faded into the night, no longer concerned with Razor or his broken empire. The town that had once bowed to his will now stood as a quiet witness to his defeat. There was nothing left here for him. No power, no followers, no hope of reclaiming the life he had known. Razor took a shaky step forward, his legs weak beneath him. His hands, still trembling, reached for the bottle of whiskey that sat on the bar. He poured himself a drink, his fingers unsteady as the amber liquid splashed into the glass. The burning warmth of the alcohol did little to soothe the ache in his chest. Nothing would. He downed the drink in one go, the harsh burn in his throat a temporary distraction from the storm raging in his mind. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he could control everything, that he could shape the world around him with his will. But now, with the rancher's words still lingering in the air, Razor felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The door to the saloon creaked open, and Razor's heart skipped a beat. He turned, half expecting to see the rancher standing there once more, ready to finish what he had started. But it wasn't the rancher. It was one of his men, a rider still clad in black, his face obscured by a scarf. Razor's eyes narrowed, instinctively reaching for the gun at his side, but the rider raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Don't," the rider said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to fight." Razor didn't lower his hand, though his grip on the gun loosened slightly. "What do you want?" The rider stepped into the room, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor as he approached the bar. He gave Razor a long, steady look before speaking. "The rancher sent me," the rider said. "He wants you to know that this is your last chance. Leave now while you still can, before you lose everything." Razor's mind reeled. The rancher had sent this rider, this messenger, to offer him a choice. One last chance to walk away from everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in. "Leave," Razor repeated, his voice hoarse. "You think I'll just walk away from this? From the life I've built?" The rider's eyes softened, a flicker of something akin to pity crossing his face. "The life you've built is already gone," he said quietly. "There's nothing left for you here. You'll be free to go, but only if you leave now. If you stay, it'll be worse than you can imagine." Razor's hand tightened around the glass. The rider's words stung, but there was no anger in them, only truth. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The rancher wasn't offering him mercy. He was offering him the chance to escape before the inevitable came crashing down on him. "I'm not a coward," Razor spat, his voice thick with defiance. "I won't just run." The rider sighed, his gaze steady. "You've never understood what it means to surrender, have you?" he asked, his tone more thoughtful than accusatory. "Surrendering isn't about weakness. It's about understanding when you've already lost, when there's nothing left to fight for." The rancher didn't want this to end like this, but you forced his hand. Razor's fists clenched at his sides, the anger bubbling up again. But it was different this time. It wasn't the fiery rage of someone who was still fighting for control. It was the helpless anger of a man who knew deep down that the battle was already over. He had lost, and nothing he did now could change that. The rider took a step back, as if he could sense the conflict inside Razor. "Think about it," he said softly, his voice calm but insistent. "You don't have to die here. You don't have to lose everything. Walk away while you still can." Razor stood there for a long moment, the weight of the rider's words sinking in, each one carving a deeper wound into his pride. He had spent his life building this empire, shaping the world around him with fear and violence. And now, in one single moment, it had all come crashing down. The rancher had taken it all. And the worst part was, Razor had no one to blame but himself. "I won't beg," Razor muttered, his voice thick with bitterness. The rider didn't respond. He simply turned, his boots echoing as he made his way to the door. Before leaving, he paused and glanced back at Razor, his eyes holding something Razor couldn't quite place. "Sometimes," the rider said, his voice low, "the strongest thing you can do is let go." And with that, the rider left, disappearing into the night. Razor stood alone in the saloon once more, the words hanging in the air like a specter. Let go. The strongest thing you can do is let go. He didn't know how long he stood there, lost in thought, the weight of his defeat settling like a stone in his chest. The world outside was quiet now, the last remnants of his empire slipping away into the night. The town that had once feared him was now under the rancher's control, and there was nothing Razor could do to change that. But as the silence stretched on, something in Razor shifted. The anger, the pride, the need for revenge, they began to fade. They had no power here, not anymore. And in that moment, Razor understood what the rider had meant. Sometimes the hardest thing to do was to let go. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only way forward. Razor turned and walked to the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The town stretched out before him, silent, empty, the weight of his defeat hanging over it. But as he walked away, something in him shifted. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't fleeing. He was simply moving on. He had lost everything. But in that loss, Razor realized something else. He still had the chance to find himself again. And maybe, for the first time in his life, that was enough. Razor's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way through the darkened streets, his mind clouded with the weight of everything he had just learned. The saloon behind him faded into the night, and with it, the remnants of the life he had known. The empire, the fear, the control, it was all gone. And for the first time, Razor wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or crushed by the loss. The ride was over, and he had no idea where the road would take him next. The town was eerily quiet now. The riders had moved on, and the rancher's presence had already begun to settle like a fog over everything. Razor glanced back toward the saloon, his thoughts heavy with the realization that it was no longer a place for him. No place was, not anymore. His empire had crumbled. His men had deserted him, and even the familiar landscape of this small, dusty town now seemed foreign. It felt like the world had changed in the blink of an eye. But as Razor walked, a strange clarity began to take shape in his mind. The anger, the burning desire for revenge. It was fading. Perhaps it had been fading for some time, but tonight it was gone. There was nothing left to fight for, and maybe that was a good thing. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start again. He paused in front of an old, weathered shack just outside of town. The kind of place that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The kind of place he would have ignored once. But now, in this moment of reflection, it seemed to call to him. It was a place untouched by the chaos of the world. A place untouched by fear and power. Razor walked toward the shack, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't know why he was here or what he was supposed to do, but it felt like a place where the past could be buried and forgotten, where he could finally leave behind the man he had been. There was no rancher, no riders, no empire. Just him and the silence that filled the air. He stepped inside the shack and took a deep breath, the stale air thick with dust. It felt like a world apart from everything that had happened in the town. In that silence, Razor felt the weight of everything. The years of violence, the years of striving for control, the years of crushing everything in his path. And now, in this moment, he felt the most fragile he had ever been. The armor he had built around himself for so long had cracked, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rebuild it. Razor lowered himself onto a rickety chair in the corner, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the bare walls. Outside, the wind howled softly, but inside the shack, there was only stillness. The night had taken on a strange sense of peace, like the calm after a storm, when the world finally stopped spinning. He closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy breath, as if exhaling all the rage, all the regret, all the lost years of his life. The road had brought him here, to this place, to this moment, and Razor finally understood that the journey wasn't about power, wasn't about control. It was about finding peace, even in the midst of everything falling apart. He had fought so long, so hard, to keep his empire intact. But now, standing on the edge of nothing, Razor realized that the empire had never been his to begin with. It had always belonged to the land, to the people, to the rancher, to the quiet strength that had shattered his world. Razor opened his eyes, staring into the darkness that surrounded him. There was no going back. The world he had known was gone, and in its place was an uncertain future. But there was something oddly liberating about it. The shack, the silence, it was a clean slate, an opportunity to begin again. He stood up slowly, his body stiff from the tension of the past few days. The world was still out there, waiting, and Razor knew he couldn't stay here forever. But for the first time, he wasn't running from anything. He wasn't trying to control anything. He was simply living. He could go wherever he wanted, do whatever he chose. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Razor stepped back outside, feeling the cool night air on his skin. The moon hung high above, casting its pale light over the landscape, and Razor felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew it didn't matter. He had walked a long and painful path, but now he was free. As Razor stood there, looking out over the land that had once been his to conquer, he realized that the rancher had given him something he hadn't expected, an escape. Not just from the empire he had built, but from the man he had become. Razor wasn't sure where the road would take him, but for the first time, he didn't need to know. He didn't need to control it. The wind picked up and Razor took one last look at the town below, the place that had once been his kingdom. It was no longer his, but it was someone else's now, and that was the way it was supposed to be. Razor turned and began to walk, his step steady, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. And as he disappeared into the night, the sound of the wind was the only thing that followed him. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.